you all for coming today. Um, so I, so that's kind of what Allison just said. I did want to ask a question to start, which is, and I know your answer, but how many of you are either involved with the startup or thinking that's something you're going to do? Okay, so fair number. And the rest of the presentation is sort of geared around that, but it will, I'm also going to address just negotiation kind of generally. It has applications beyond just the startups, but that's a perspective that I was kind of taking. Um, so actually on this slide, um, my first CMU startup that I represented that actually successfully exited was in 1994. And it was one of the first internet companies to actually come out of Pittsburgh. It's not surprising it came out of CMU. Started in 1994. It was in the financial services industry, actually putting mutual fund prospectuses on the internet. At that particular point in time, you couldn't buy or sell stocks on the internet. It was actually even very controversial. Could I actually put information on the internet concerning like a mutual fund because there were certain SEC requirements that had to be met? It was kind of a brave new world. That was started by three CMU graduate students. And in 1995, just a year later, the company was sold to Intuit, which is still around today. Um, we thought it was an incredible sale at the time. We sold the company for $10 million. And, oh, that's fine. And no one had really even any awareness of the internet. The early investors made 3 or 4x, and they were all very happy with the deal that they had done. Um, and probably a year or two later, that 10 million would have been 100. And then a couple of years later, probably would have been a billion because they were really, at the cutting edge of things to come. Um, so if you've come this far, you got my background, so you're already a third in. So if you're not bored yet, we'll see what we can do the rest of the way. Um, this is my overview. And again, this is because this is very geared towards, representing startup clients. So there's a lot of pre-deal preparation that you should be doing. And that's really thinking about what you need to get out of the relationship. It's not the same as it would be for a big company that's just contracting with another big company. And I'll get to some of the things that would be involved with that. One of the key things that you have to be concerned with early on is the patent portfolio issues. Not for every company, but in many, many instances, as you go into these negotiations, um, if they're not protected, then the party on the other side, which has a lot more resources, could actually come out of it and say, oh, maybe I'll file some patents in this area. And you'd think, oh, they wouldn't do that, but they actually do in many instances. So you need to have kind of proper legal protection in place, a confidentiality agreement with them, et cetera. Um, but the other considerations for the early stage company are basically thinking about, again, what do I want to get out of this deal? Um, and then you want to take a step back again before the negotiation and really think about, well, what does the other company want to get out of this deal? And it's not the same thing as what you want. For one thing, they may want to get access to new technologies. This could be things that either they can't create or they haven't created. Um, the use of those technologies often is to put it into existing products that they have or processes that they have to create new revenue opportunities. And finally, it's that many companies today don't want to invest in research and development. So for them, it's a way to leverage the resources that they have by sort of finding other new technologies that would be useful to them. Um, in sort of a different way of looking at this, this is the way I typically step back from things when I'm contacted. And the questions that I ask the client are usually, what do you need today? What are the things that you're really concerned about? And what are you willing to give up to get that? And again, I'll go into that in a little more detail. Then taking a step back again and saying, what do they want out of it? And what do you think they're willing to give up to get that? And finally, what's the longer term, short and longer term consequence to your company? And again, as you go further down the startup route, those things change in terms of what's important and what you're willing to give up. So what I did in this presentation is sort of look at a couple of key subject areas and break those down to use those general principles um, to define what you want out of these various things. So the first is a university license. Um, I'm sort of basing this off the typical CMU license, which is one that I've helped to negotiate 50 times. And in that, it's important to kind of realize with the university, and it could be with another party in a different context, there's some things that will be negotiable and some things that won't be negotiable at all. Um, the key aspects are the core technology, what you're getting, the licensed and sub-licensed rights. And the reason, of course, that that's important is because that really defines what you can do with this technology. And you want to make sure when you look at your business model, what you intend to do, that the license grant that you get allows you to do that and maybe even allows you to expand from that. So here's one example. We always think about a license and sort of you get something, then you license it to somebody else, and then they use that technology. But sometimes what happens is you get it, you license it to somebody else, and then they want to sublicense it to someone else. In other words, take that license and use it with a third party. You have to make sure that your license with the university would allow you to do something like that. And typically they do, but this is one area where universities can be somewhat opaque about really understanding the business model of the company. So you want to make sure that you're covering those things. Then there are other aspects, the key aspects of any license, and the CMU license, let's say in particular, which go to how much will you give up to get that license? What percentage of equity in the company will you give up, and what kind of royalties? And it looks like that's saying those are non-negotiable provisions, but actually some of those provisions can be negotiable if you are talking to the licensing officer and actually explaining to them, this is how my company's going to operate. This is why I can't pay you this percentage, because if I did that, I wouldn't be profitable. I wouldn't be able to get investors and so on. On the other side of that equation is why the university is willing to license this technology to you. Now, in many cases, it's because this is something that you and a team have worked on over a period of time. So you're the obvious party to get that license. But they may have the ability to license it to a much bigger company, in which case they'd probably get a lot more revenues, et cetera, out of that. So that's the counter side of it. Another aspect of the core license is just what options you have on new developments and what happens if you want to sell the company. To take a step back from these kind of in general, some of these provisions are ones where the university is not going to negotiate with you at all. Not these so much, but other aspects of that license agreement. So it's really important when you go into things, if you're dealing with a licensing officer or whomever, that you kind of say to them, can you tell me the parts of the license agreement, assuming you're not using a lawyer or you just want to, take it a certain part of the way. What parts of this are you really not going to negotiate with me? What parts does the university just say, we don't allow people to touch them? Some of them are more arcane, more like the liabilities of the university. They're never going to negotiate that. It's basically going to be, we're giving this to you. As far as we know, it doesn't infringe anybody else. Go forth and make something of yourself. But if something comes back to you, in most instances, our liability is really limited. And that's because it's a university and they don't want to go out of business because they granted a bad license. That's one aspect. And the other is kind of, if you get into trouble, you're going to indemnify us 100%, you meaning the university, you're going to indemnify the university because for the same reason, which is they don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to be in financial situation where this turned out to be a really bad deal for them. So those are two examples, but there are many within the university license where typically for me to review a license is about 2 hours because I know that they're not going to negotiate certain things. I want to focus on the things that the company really needs, and I want to, not spend a lot of time on things that they don't. When it comes to things like equity and royalties, I'm going to say to the client, well, what kind of conversations have you had with the university about these things? And in many instances, they will say to you, we exhaustively talked about this, and I'm not going to be able to make any progress doing any better. Um, the second area that I wanted to touch on is this area of the key hires. And I wanted to use an example from another CMU spin out company that I represented probably a decade ago. And they were hiring, they had sort of gotten through the stage where it was a pretty sexy company. They had put together a team. They had developed the intellectual property. They actually had kind of even productized it at that point. They had a product that they could sell. Uh, the the entrepreneur who was behind it had made some early sales of the technology to kind of people that he knew through academia, who had been involved as he was researching this technology and developing it. So, he didn't have, he had $1 million, let's say, of sales at that particular point in time, but the pipeline was kind of dry as it related to new sales. And again, they had a product and they're in a position to sell it. So they went out and said, okay, we got to get a vice president of sales. And so I think they hired a headhunter, went out, scoured around, found somebody that seemed to have all the right credentials um, to be the VP of sales. He had worked for a big company. Some of the customers that he had dealt with seemed to be ones that these guys could go after as well. I don't think there was no non-compete issue or anything like that. So they ended up hiring this VP of sales. Um, so as it turned out, guy came in, started, kind of in earnest. They got him up to speed on the product. But they quickly sort of started to run into a problem because while he had been with a big company and he had a lot of these purportedly had a lot of these customer contracts, he was really managing a reseller network. He was not making direct sales to these kind of customers. So what happened was he said he came in and they gave him a pretty good salary. They were funded, but they didn't have that much money. And he said, well, I got to hire a team here. I mean, I'm not the guy who goes out in the field and really finds these things. I manage people who find these deals. So early on, it became very apparent. I think we got the wrong guy. Um, and then also, he didn't really have the kind of customer relationships because he was managing through another party. So he didn't really know these customers. He couldn't really call them on the phone and say, hey, I'm working with this new company now, and I was wondering if you could take a look at this technology. Anyways, the net was that he didn't work out. So that would have been a big problem if we had done what he suggested we do at the very beginning. And he kind of said, look, I'm going to be integral to your success. Just give me 10% of the company up front. Just give me the 10%. You'll see, I will not disappoint you. So if we had actually done that, 6 months later, we would have said, whoa, we made a huge mistake with this guy. What can we do? He's got 10% of the company, and now he's going to walk out the door. Well, fortunately, we did not do that. In this instance, what we did was his equity was against, they were time-based and milestone-based. He never really stayed long enough. He didn't hit any of the milestones. So they did give him, let's say, 1 to 10%. They gave him like 1%. They kind of amicably parted. They gave him some minimal severance. That was all dealt with up front. But the key consideration here is that while you want somebody to be successful when you make these key hires at the beginning of a company, you have to prepare for the situation where they may not be successful. And if they're not successful, how do you deal with that? And it's particularly important in a startup. So if you're IBM, you make a mistake on a hire, you make a mistake on a hire. You go through it, go through the processes that IBM has. A year later, person is gone. But in a startup, there may only be 7, 8 people there at that particular point in time, or 10. And so that's going to be a heavy loss to the company. And so what actually happened in that instance, they did let him go. They were not able to replace him for actually quite a period of time, but they had other people who kind of stepped into the role and determined themselves, maybe we need to do this internally and not just try to hire someone that's going to, answer all of our prayers externally. Um, so this is another example from a more recent example, which I don't want to name the companies because they actually are still around, where this was a CMU spin out company. Again, they had developed some really interesting technology. They had productized the technology somewhat. They went to a very big company in the space and said, we have something that will really work to improve the products that you offer. And it's a consumer type of product, but um, it was lighter than what they put and it worked better, et cetera, et cetera. So there were a variety of advantages, could be used across many, many industries. So we started negotiating with them kind of in earnest. And it was kind of good. We went through the normal process of asking ourselves the questions that we should be asking ahead of time. And in our particular case, what we wanted all these things from that particular early customer. We wanted market validation by having a product that was out in the market, that while it would have been branded under their name, uh, we could tell people that's our technology is inside this. That was the first area that was a problem. Then we wanted the name recognition from them because again, they were well known in this consumer space. Yeah, that was the second problem. And then we wanted money, and kind of we wanted the money to be on the basis of how many products that they sold, not just give us a blanket license, we'll pay you $500,000. Because again, in this particular space, we could only sell to so many people. So if we actually licensed it to them for $500,000 and then we were excluded from selling to other people, we'd have a big problem as we went down the line. So every one of these things caused an issue with this particular party on the other end. So what they wanted was they wanted to be known as kind of a company with leading edge technology, and they wanted people to think that that technology was theirs. So that's why the rubber sort of hit the road with this particular deal. Um, and so we tried to work through things with them over time. The first big issue for them was, well, geez, I mean, is your intellectual property clean? We do tons of deals in this area, and we just want to make sure 100% we're not going to get sued for infringement or anything like that. So we went through this exhaustive process with them. Ultimately, they determined, yeah, I mean, it is clean. That patent issue that I referred to at the very beginning about making sure your patents are protected, we had that issue with them because actually they came out of negotiations and they filed patents on ideas that were sort of derived from the core technology of my client. They didn't tell us that. So that caused a pretty big problem as we found out, yeah, they're filing patents on things that they shouldn't. And again, we're a small company. They're a Fortune 500 company, probably a Fortune 50 company. So how do you fight them? Well, you don't really want to fight them. You don't want to go into courts and fight them because you'll spend forever. And you probably win in the end if you have 10 years and $10 million. So that's not what we wanted to have happen. And so we continued to work through these issues with this particular customer, and we were able to iron out almost everything. And then we ran into the problem that sometimes happens, which is they saw a brighter bouncing ball somewhere else. So they ultimately said, we love what you have. We think we can make more money if we actually invested our efforts in some other technology unrelated to what you're doing, and they ran into internal budget constraints. So in the end, it took about 18 months and we never got to a deal. But in retrospect, it may be the best deal that we never did because their reputation in the industry was of someone, of a company that would take your technology. They were really not willing to give us the kind of revenue from the um, the transaction itself that would have made it worthwhile. But it was a good example of kind of working through, trying to think about what they need, trying to think about what we need, and then basically 95% of the time, you will get to a deal. This is just a rare instance where we didn't get to a deal with them. It did set the company back. They had spent a lot of time with it. It had been a priority. And even though they were pursuing other things at the time, um, it was something that, it did take them a little while to recover from. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Uh, was that so because you provided a lot of time to them during the negotiation? Because in any case, if we are all clear with what the wants and needs of each other, and if the deal closing time is relatively less, can we see a potentially positive deal happening out of it?
Yeah, I mean, there was nothing in this instance. The time delays were really all caused by the other party. I mean, it was really more because the kind of issues they would raise were around intellectual property, and it would be, oh, our patent lawyers are taking this back and they're studying it, and then they come back to us 2 months later with a series of questions, and so on. Yeah, I don't think in this particular deal we won't. I don't think we'll transact with them in the future. I don't think that's going to happen. But, again, it was a good thing. The company at the same time was pursuing other avenues, but this would have really been an important contract for them. In most instances, with that, you do try to get it done. Like as the lawyer involved with it, you do try to say, well, we can't do it this way. We could do it this way. And there's usually, again, you'll find some common ground. In this particular instance, it just didn't happen. So the final area that I wanted to look at, just briefly, because this isn't really one on raising capital. This isn't a seminar on raising capital, and that alone is something that's hours and hours to negotiate the kind of term sheets that you use when you're raising money from institutional investors. But it's sort of looking at this from this same lens. How much capital do you need to take the company to the next level? And is this the right financial partner? One of the funds that I represent is a local one called 412 Ventures. And, it's kind of an ad for them, but they are actually a really good investor. They really actually try to spend the time and really understand the company and work very cooperatively with the company. In my experience, most venture capitalists are like that. They really are. But one of the things that's really important is it has to be very consistent with what your view is of how you're going to run this company and how much control you're willing to give up. And that probably comes a lot back down to your particular personality, and how willing you are to listen to someone else who's sitting at the table and may have more experience than you have, but may not have a better idea than you have. You also want to make sure that the company that you take money from shares the same vision that you have for where this company can go. So, for example, in some instances, it's sort of, look, I've done 5 startups. I take them to this level and then I try to sell them. In other instances, it might be, this is my idea of a lifetime, and I don't want to sell it too early. I really want to see this thing through. I want to give it, this is the next decade of my life. I really want to spend doing this. Um, and again, similar to some of the other topics, you always want to be thinking about what are the longer term consequences of the deal. Some of those I mentioned before. Some of those are, with an investor, do I want to bring other people around the table later on, or do I really kind of say, this is my partner and I want to see it through with them. So I really like them, etc. And again, am I willing to give somebody the ability to sit on my board of directors or as an advisor, an observer, et cetera? And am I willing to listen to the kind of things that they have to say? to make my company successful? Or am I really the type of person who says, I don't really need their advice. I think I know what I'm doing. And with many serial entrepreneurs, you do get that. And sometimes they're right, that they're better off not really having a very active board. So I wanted to summarize it briefly by kind of saying, again, the most important things are as a startup, um, you want to, first of all, realize that, you're a young company, you don't have all the leverage, but you want to get in the game. So that's why the one example I gave where we weren't able to get to a deal, that's not the way you want things to turn out. Even if you say to yourself, well, I hate them and they're scumbags. In the end, you really want to get to a deal if you can get to a deal, because that's what gets you in the game as a startup. So you can sit there forever and kind of say, I'm better than this, and I shouldn't have to deal with this. But in some respects, there's a little give and take. The second is that as a startup, your leverage changes over time. So where you may start off, and I have to tell many of my clients, like, look, we're going to get kicked around here. It's not going to be fun, and we're not going to be able to say the kind of things we'd like to say, and so on. At the same time, as you progress, you're known better within the industry, your technology gets some acceptance, then you have greater leverage in any negotiation to push back on more things. And again, as you gain credibility in an industry, then people are more willing to talk with you. And the third kind of takeaway is try to listen to what the other side is saying to you, both in the course of the negotiations and maybe more importantly, outside of the negotiations themselves, which is go to dinner with them, spend some time with not just, with as many people within that organization as you can to really try to understand where they are and what they're trying to get to. And a lot of times there's many people, most people, that are more than willing to talk with you about what they're doing and what they want to do. And they may even tell you some of the things that they shouldn't be telling you about that negotiation. So really spend the time to try to, get to know the other people. And then again, when you have a chance to do it, try to find out more things that would be helpful to you in the negotiation itself. Um, and that's it. Yeah.
Thanks for the. Um, I like the saying bad news early is good news. And then like I said, if you can't make it feel actually okay, but you don't want to find that out after a huge amount of time that's been invested. What do you find powerful or effective to kind of avoid miscommunication late in the game and like as early as possible separate if it looks like you're going
I mean, that's a really good point. One salesperson that I used to teach a course in commercialization of technology here, part of the course. And one of the guys who would come in and talk about sales would always say, if it's not going to be a customer, I want to put a bullet in their head early. Like, I don't want to waste my time with people who are not really going to be customers. He was actually a really, really good salesperson, VP of sales. Yeah, I think there are signs. And in that particular deal, there were signs. And I would say to the client, these guys, this is not like a typical negotiation that we have. They don't seem to be a win-win kind of company. Are we sure we want to spend the time with it? I think the CEO made the right decision trying to see it through because it really would have been a multi-million dollar deal for them. And I wasn't encouraging him not to. I was just saying, I'm not seeing the signs here that tells me that we're going to get there.
Can you share signs on saying what makes you overlook?
Well, one was the fact that they walked out of a meeting and filed patents, which is just unconscionable, really. And they didn't say to my client, like, oh, by the way, we're going to file some patents in this space too. And that's really, from a legal standpoint, very questionable what they did. I feel like they did it because they knew we weren't in a position to sue them. But when somebody contributes to an idea, when we contributed to the idea, or it's derived from something else, really you should be named as an inventor in the patent and sort of co-own that patent with them. So we never got to the point of really threatening them, but we could have. We just didn't have the resources to do it. So I would say, yeah, the signs were there. And then it was that they would multiple times come back to us and say, we want you to research this area of your patents. We want you, and my response to the client was, let them do it. Let them spend the money. I feel like they're asking you to spend a lot of money, so you'll be at the point where you'll just do any deal because you've got so much invested in this. But that's a good question, and really, yeah, you're not going to get there. You're not going to get there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Okay.
I do have a question here on Zoom.
Okay.
I have a question here on Zoom.
Sure.
So thanks for the wonderful talk. I was wondering for university spin out startups, the licensing problem, like how are there any resources that I can look at to find out what kind of license or like what the process is, or is there is it necessary to get a license? So I'm a PhD student at CMU, and we've patented one of the research works that I did at CMU. And I'm thinking about starting a startup around and building from this already patented technology. So I was wondering, like, is it required that our startup has to be university licensed? Or like, it would be great if there are any resources around that I can look at it
So
to understand.
who owns the patent? The university?
The university, so I think, so there are 4 authors on the paper. Me and my advisor, we own 30% each. I have 2 advisors, so that make up 90%. And then there's another co-author that owns 10%, I think. But
Of the patent or of the company?
of the patent,
Uh,
we have not started a company yet.
okay, if the university doesn't own the patent, then I don't think you'd have to license it from the university unless they claim some kind of ownership. So in that instance, you wouldn't have to. In most instances, the university has filed the patent, and so you have to license it from the university. Uh, in terms of the resources, well, for one thing, they'll give you the form of license. I think if you say to them, look, we might want to license something out of technology, can we see the form of license? I think they'll typically either give it to you or it might be available even online. It probably is. And then you could always talk to a licensing officer about, can you walk me through this? Can you tell me what aspects are negotiable, what really aren't negotiable? And I know it would seem like, well, geez, I don't want to ask them that question, but they're actually pretty nice and they're not trying to take advantage of the students in any ways. I found them to be very, very cooperative.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there's probably articles you could read also. They might be more generic. They might not be specifically about CMU, but I'm sure if you Googled it, you'd find articles about licensing out of technology or out of universities.
Does CMU have like CMU dedicated rules or like?
Yeah, I mean, they have a form of license that they use. And again, if you talk to a licensing officer, they're going to tell you, look, section 12, 13, and 14, we would never negotiate anything in that, which means if you did it, you wouldn't want to waste your time. And, that's what I find that's annoying. Like a lot of lawyers will waste a lot of time arguing over things that a university is not going to negotiate. And you said that's a waste of time. Just accept it. They don't want to put you out of business. These are just certain things you have to live with when your license is through a university.
Okay, got it. So talking to the licensing officer we can figure this out.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Sure.